with Chombo. There's also a sister package called VoxLib. You might have seen either of these described. They are library frameworks written in C++ and Fortran to help you do calculations that involve block structured adaptive meshing. So in block structured adaptive meshing, you have you start with a uniform grid on the base level. It might be domain decomposed to do parallelism. And then as you tag regions that need more refinement, you put finer grid embedded directly on those patches. And you've probably seen adaptive unstructured grids where there's tets or hexes kind of coming and going as the calculation goes. So we're doing structured adaptive. So they're little structured grids getting dropped onto bigger structured grids. So part of the pros and cons of doing this. So you can think of doing adaptive mesh refinement as doing compression, but at an algorithm level. So you're representing the solution with a sparse representation, and you do all of your numerics and your discretization and your post-processing, your time stepping, all in this kind of sparse data representation. So you can get very high resolution where you need it. The nice thing about little structured grids is that you tend to do kind of unit striding through the cache hierarchy. So the prefetcher is very happy about this kind of data organization. You have little structured blocks on the heap memory. So the vectorizer is happier in the compiler. The memory hierarchy moves data up and down more efficiently. And you can do very high resolution problems, because a lot of the kind of connectivity in a structured AMR package is implicit. I don't need to do a calculation to look up where my next point is to me for many points as I move along. So if your blocks are 32 by 32 by 32, you can move from point to point to point with just kind of loops, so I, J, K loops. And you can even, if it's fixed size grids, you can even tell the compiler how many points it's going to jump from point to point. So there's ways of compiling these codes where you can tell it more and more information, and you give up some of your flexibility. So the default mode is running it with arbitrary size patches that are modular some size. And unfortunately makes it hard to write your algorithms this way, right? Everything gets a little bit harder when you put in adaptive meshing. Parts of the complexity problem. So you need to have things that help to do interpolation and coarsening correctly. Any algorithm that has parabolic or hyperbolic components in them, like a PDE with a first derivative term or a third derivative term in it, you'll have things like fluxes, or even if you do divergence theorems, you have to do all the kind of the bookkeeping right. So at each of these coarse fine boundaries, you still need to satisfy the PDE. So someone previously had asked, what happens when you walk off the edge of the patch? It says 85% of the code in this package handles the problem of what happens when I walk off the edge of the patch. So particularly at higher order. So a lot of our algorithms nowadays are fourth order codes. So we're third order in space, fourth order in time. To do fourth order and we're all finite volume schemes, most of what you're doing here. So conservative fourth order schemes that walk off the edge of the patch have to still be conservative, have to still be fourth order. So Godunov's theorem tells you anytime the grid spacing changes, you will lose an order, but you will do so locally. So at a boundary, at an embedded boundary, at a coarse fine boundary, in the truncation terms sequence, it is unavoidable to lose one order in your truncation accuracy. So you try to make sure that when you do your mesh generation, that's not where the coarse fine boundary isn't where something important is happening. So in those previous pictures, you saw kind of the mock snail problem. And where you see all the kind of mesh on there is where there's a mock line or a shock line, or there's a reentrant corner, or there's a turbulent boundary layer. So those things you mesh all the way up, and then you kind of push your coarse fine boundaries a little bit away from the problem. Truncation order is a multiplier on some derivatives of your solution. So if you take the Taylor expansions out, you'll see that the third term has some kind of third derivative of the solution to it. So as long as that coarse-defined boundary isn't somewhere where the third derivative is high, well, then that truncation term doesn't contribute much to your code problem error. And doing time evolution of these codes involves another complexity called subcycling. So I'll get into that, but that comes as a later example. Here's just a short list of codes that we're involved in. So these are packages that are built on top of Chombo. So you download Chombo, that gives you, our AMR tools, our box tools, our AMR time dependent, our AMR elliptic solvers, and our AMR time integrators, and our mesh refiner, and our kind of link to the I/O subsystem, and then a bunch of examples. And most people take one of our examples, say, well, your AMR polytropic gas dynamics problem is pretty close to my problem, so I'll start with that. Or your Chombo MHD code looks pretty close to what I'm trying to do, so I'll start there. And then you copy that example, and then you start changing it for your physics. This kind of cut and paste reuse of our examples, and then go on from there. It is still difficult, even with that as a starting point, because you have to write code. The other sister code base for us is BoxLib. So this is John Bell and his team, and there's a list of projects that they're involved in. Their projects are much more vertically integrated with their team. So they work on BoxLib. They also write Maestro, which is an astrophysics code. They write Castro, which is another astrophysics code. They do Nix, which is a cosmology code. RNS is a kind of internal research code. LMC is the low Mach number combustion code. They are very involved all the way into the science applications. So if you are involved in, say, supernova work, or if you are involved in cosmology, evolution, and dark matter, that's Nix. Or if you are involved in doing combustion type problems, so reaction, diffusion, advection problems, you might actually not only work with BoxLib, you might actually collaborate with their team. So you actually talk to them directly. I work with a lot of these people, but I don't actually do a whole lot of any of these things, right? So this is a very much larger list. So we have what's called kind of the valid region and the ghost region in a patch. So the green would be called your valid region. This is where you're responsible for computing your values. Your blue halo or your ghost cells are what I call application level caching. Right? These don't this data exists on another processor, the other processor, or the other processing element. It could be a process, it could be a thread, but it owns the light blue area. You own the green area. So you tend to compute on what you own, and then you have phases in the code where you fill. You exchange, or you fill from a coarser level, and then you go on and do the next part of the calculation. I've already mentioned that there are two packages, so I don't have to describe this except point out that you get BoxLib by going to the CCSE webpage and go to BoxLib, and then you'll encounter Git, and it's a Git repo, and you'll do a Git pull or a Git clone. The Chombo repo is on our ANAG server, which is the Applied Numerical Algorithms group, and it is a SVN subversion repo. For most people, there's not much difference between these two version control systems. They run their Git like we run our subversion, so it is a central repo, and you pull from it, and you don't tend to do too much branching or cloning. In Chombo, we use HDF5 for our parallel I/O, so you'll need an HDF5 installed on your machine if you want to download and run Chombo. BoxLib has their kind of own native POSIX parallel I/O that they've hand-rolled. So in a sense, BoxLib is a little easier to set up and build. BoxLib does much more Fortran. So there's a Fortran version, and there's a C++ and Fortran version. But depending on if you want to do Maestro type work, or if you want to do kind of LMC type work, you might get a more F90 version of the code. Chombo is, from the user level all the way down to the kernels, is all C++. And our next version is going to be more C++ 11-ish. But that only matters to some of you. The examples I'm going to show today are in Chombo, but there's very similar code in the tutorials and examples for BoxLib. So we do kind of data reuse by templating. The fundamental data holder in our world is a base fab. Fab is an archaic reference to Fortran ordered array box. So this means that a multidimensional array in our base fab object, in C, you just have the one big flat array. You just have fancy ways of indexing into it. So we've chosen the one big flat array so it looks like how Fortran wants to have the one big flat array. So you can hand this into Fortran as a multidimensional array, and then your ijk loop works just like you expect it would work. So you index ijk in Fortran, and then up in the C++ layer, you can either use an iterator object that walks through the points in the right order, or we have a macro that helps you kind of walk through it in the correct ordering. So FArrayBox is the specialization for real data, and real is a macro which is either double or float, so you can be single or double precision, or quad, and then all Chombo still compiles with quad, or double, or whatever your kind of floating point data type is. We just have requirements that data floating point type supports a certain amount of algebra. So it has to have a plus, has to have a multiply, has to have a divide. So we also have a version of the code which is complex. So you can run all of Chombo as complex numbers. We didn't need that until last year, until I was working on a new algorithm that does need all complex. So I fixed it up, and now it does all work with complex. So then you have, so on any given box or any given patch, you have an FArrayBox, which is a bunch of data sitting out on that particular patch, and that patch is assigned to a particular processing element. And then a whole level on the AMR hierarchy is a level data, and then you build up a whole AMR hierarchy as a vector of these objects. So fairly simple data structures. It gets a little bit harder when you have particles or when you have embedded boundaries. I'm probably not going to go into those examples, and it's not in your tutorial, but if you need complex geometry, or if you need to be mixing particle code and structured mesh, then you probably need to be talking to either us or the Box Lab team. But we have lots of tools to support you. So let's get more down in the weeds. So we have a box. Box is a low point and a high point. You make your FArrayBox with a box, and how many components is in your data structure. So here I'm just doing a scalar. So I have a domain, I have one. I can set values, I can multiply, I can add. So FArrayBox supports a fairly rudimentary, algebra based on the fact that the object inside of the FArrayBox supports an algebra. This is starting to look a little bit more like, using matrices and stuff in a MATLAB program. But this is almost the first thing you would write with multidimensional arrays in C++, right? Everyone writes this at some point. So we've written it too, and we've tried to write a better version than you would write on your own. But if you like your array object better, you can shove it in to our Box Lab and run our level data, and we'll do the communication for you. Patches can be coming and going throughout your code evolution. I would say the Box Lab and Chombo are really wired up to do time-dependent problems. So if you have a kind of static, non-time-dependent problem, much of the machinery in our packages doesn't help you much. We do get more people asking for support for kind of static problems. Mostly what they want is very complicated static PDEs, in which case you have very stiff problems. So towards the end of the talk, I'm going to talk about the PETSc interface, where you can describe your discretization in this way, but then when it comes to actually inverting your problem and getting a solution, you pull out the big guns for kind of stiff PDEs. To bootstrap yourself up, you first lay down your mesh, you throw down your initial guess, your initial solution, and then you already start running your tagging algorithm. And then your tagging algorithm starts dropping, so you're in the tagging algorithm on level 0, it gives you level 1 grids. You're on your tagging algorithm on level 1, it gives you level 2 grids. And you keep going until you've met some kind of criteria. Either this is as many levels as I want, or oftentimes you'll say the divided difference of some value that I'm kind of tagging on, so say vorticity or a stress tensor, the undivided difference goes below a certain value. And that kind of correlates to what your truncation error is going to look like. And then so you build up a hierarchy. So say I have, in the blue region, I have some very discontinuous property. On the left, maybe I have unshocked gas, and on the right, I have high pressure detonation, or that's an interface where porosity changes dramatically, or it's an interface where some nice uniform grid is not going to get the right answer. So you put tags down, so you mark those cells as needing grid, and then you tag cells, you go to the next level, you go back, and you make new grids, and then you're going to go back down the level below you, because what you want is proper nesting. So proper nesting is the kind of last term I have there, because when you reach off with a ghost cell, you would like not to reach and hit 2 levels down or 3 levels down. Now Godunov's theorem really kicks you in the nuts. Having that little buffer region each time smooths out that type of discontinuity. So this proper nesting also makes the code easier to organize, because you only have between 1 level interactions. So there are operators in BoxLive that let you reach, say, 2 levels down and 3 levels down, but those tend to be performance killers, right? That kind of multi-level patch fill is a very hard piece of code to optimize on every platform. So then you collect up boxes. So this is the dropping the boxes onto it. And you can get different meshes depending on how you set your efficiency. Efficiency is a ratio of how many cells did I tag and how many cells are in the box. So when it comes time to, it's called an image segmentation problem, where you need to figure out how do I tile a region with patches that have nice properties, so they're either very rectangular or they're of size 32 or 64 or 16, while also respecting the tags, which didn't have that property when they came in. So this is an image segmentation problem, and each of these little I can get very high efficiency, like over on this side, but you can see that I have lots of interbox boundaries as a result. I've had to really kind of break boxes up and stack them together in very weird shapes. And at each of those little boundaries, there's going to be extra code that executes, right? I have ghost cells that hang off. I'm going to do redundant calculations in those points. And also, my loops don't get to see nice, big, strided loops where I get the prefetcher gets to easily predict what's going to happen next. So, the processor likes what's over on the left in terms of execution styles, but if you go too much that way, you can see how much of the domain is getting tiled up. So your AMR efficiency is dropping. At some point, you might as well just run a uniform grid calculation. So you have to figure out where you need to be for your efficiency. So not all problems are candidates for doing AMR. If your porosity or your other properties that you're trying to track are fractal in nature, or self-similar, or slowly varying, but rapidly varying in time, for instance, maybe you aren't going to do adaptive meshing. You need to be somewhere in the sweet spot. So some disciplines know they're in the sweet spot and have known it for decades. So cosmologists and astrophysicists have been doing AMR for a very long time. Other disciplines are kind of new to it. So we're doing some subsurface work now, and we're doing, when previously subsurface, let's say reservoir simulations or groundwater modeling, a big uniform grid was the name of the game, because you're going to run seismic. You're going to do, you're going to have to run wave equation. Wave equation is hard to do with adaptive meshes. But now they're realizing things like fractures are very important. They very much change the nature of what's going to happen underground. And if you really want to see a fracture, a uniform grid just mushes it out. It spreads it over like one cell. But one cell is probably like 45 meters across in a reservoir simulation. So you're not really seeing a fracture, you're seeing a pit. So the answer really comes out wrong. You need to chase down that resolution. So various disciplines are coming to AMR now, and you'll hear, I'll get to the scaling later. The tricky part is also if you are hyperbolic or parabolic, you often have stability constraints. What is cycling? First, I'll describe what it is. So you have a space-time PDE, and you're going to evolve the coarse grid a coarse time step. The delta t on the coarse grid is the delta t over delta x ratio you need for stability. It is how fast a wave could move through one cell in one time step, basically. So you advance that one coarse time step, then you use it to form boundary conditions on the blue grids. And then the blue grids advance their time steps. And then no, actually no, you're going on the red grids. And then the red grid comes back and advances the blue grid. So there's a green line in there, which is doing the middle grid. But the idea is that the coarse grid advances, the one finer than it does its advance, the one finer than it does its advance, and you keep subcycling the finest grid until you meet up the coarser grid in time. And then you have to resolve the fact that the fine grid and the coarse grid got a different answer at that point in time. And if you want to recover your time accuracy and your discretization and your spatial accuracy, you need to do what's called either refluxing or synchronization. So sometimes you have to call an elliptic solve just on the boundary of these grids. So that elliptic solve has to do things like, you have a defect in your solution at that boundary, and you have to resolve that defect to get global convergence. So you want various properties that you need conserved. You got to reinforce that at each of these synchronization points. What happens if you don't subcycle? So say I take this whole AMR hierarchy and I say, move forward one time step, please. Well, you're going to have to pick a time step. If you pick a time step that's nice for the coarse grid, you're going to violate stability on the finer grids. So then, okay, I'm going to move everything at the finest time step. Well, now the coarse grids are moving at a very small time step. So there's another kind of error in an evolving PDE system. That's phase error. And you probably need to take a course from Phil Colello to learn how phase error really works. But he has lecture notes. But essentially, taking a coarse grid and advancing it through a very, 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 very fine, small time step introduces another kind of error. So if you actually want good solutions to something that has time dependency and you have a nice big hierarchy, you really do need to do subcycling. Usually you start your algorithms where you don't subcycle, you get everything else working right, but you gotta come back and you gotta start subcycling at some point. So that's a little bit of complexity. I think all adaptive grids need to do this, but it's easier to do it with structured adaptive. So we provide a lot of tools. Let's go to data structures. So we have two types of iterators that visit the boxes. So layout iterator will visit every box. And you use this for things like when you want to do diagnostics, how many points are there, or you want to kind of calculate, we use layout iterator quite often inside of our codes. What application people use more is data iterator. And data iterator is an object that visits the boxes that I own. So we have a compute locally compute model. So it's SPIMD style parallel computing. And the data iterator lets you visit just the boxes that you own. And whether you're processes or whether you're OpenMP threads, the data iterator helps you figure that part out. We also do one level finer than that, but that's not in this particular tutorial, where you break boxes up into smaller things. AMR applications, you have interpolation from coarse to fine. So we have the fine interp. Fine interp handles things like bringing a solution from a coarser grid up to a finer grid. So you'll use this for things like the multigrid algorithm, where you need to take a correction computed at the coarser grid and bring it up to the fine grid and use it as a correction. You'll also use this when you are bringing up you've tagged a new region and you need to initialize the data in that region. So fine interp will fill that data in. There's the opposite operation, which is coarse average. Coarse average brings data from the fine grid down to the coarse grid. The actual algorithm, the actual stencil for doing that operation can be overridden. So if you have a special way of bringing your data from the fine grid to the coarse grid, you tell the coarse averager and it'll do that operation for you. It'll also figure out how far, you have to do special things near domain boundaries. You have to do special things near coarse fine boundaries. So this has all the machinery in it to handle that operation, to help you do that operation. If you have a really funny stencil for bringing coarse to, fine to coarse, like you have one-sidedness, you have nonlinearity, you have kind of a weird switch statement, you need to override this class with your special capabilities. But these are all C++ classes, so you can, most of the functions are virtual. You can derive from this class and change the particular operation you need to change. So there's fine interaction and coarse fine interaction. There is piecewise linear fill patch. There is also quad CF interp and higher order extensions. So these are all ways of bringing data between the levels. And then there's a very special object, which is the flux registers. So flux registers have that, this is where you stash stuff that you're going to use to fix things up later. So while the fine grid is advancing in time, it's stuffing stuff into its flux register on its boundary. And at the end of the time when it's time to synchronize, the very first thing that happens is the coarse grid decrements the register, and then the fine grid increments the register. So at the end of the last step of your finest time step, you have the difference. You know how much the flux was altered by all these operations. Now, how you get that flux corrected across all the level can either be an explicit operation, you just change the value on the coarse grid for the flux, or you might need to do a solve. It depends on how stiff that particular PDE is. But you at least need something to hold the data and know how to find the coarse grid below you, know how to find the guy above me, know if my flux register is actually abutting another fine grid, in which case I don't have a fine coarse interface, I have a fine interface. So all that kind of bookkeeping is done for you. So these are awful bookkeeping to do, especially at exascale. So I have lots of clever log n type algorithms that go and figure this for you and have it available as an object you can read. Piecewise linear fill patch is doing things like filling in your ghost cells. Flux register class, right? There's the math that goes with it. It's finding the delta F you need, and then you got to run divergence on the delta F to get that correction to the U course. And my Chombo Fortran. So this is something that's different between BoxLab and us, and that is I don't like writing my kernels in 2D and 3D and having to debug each one independently. So I have dimension-independent Fortran. So you have typically in Fortran, you have the do J, do I, do whatever calculation you're going to do, and then you have your end do's. And you'll have a different version in 1D, 2D, 3D, and now there's 4D, 5D, and 6D Chombo. So 6D Chombo is for doing things like kinetics or Boltzmann. We do, recently we've had enough compute power to do these things with Eulerian methods. Traditionally, those all have been done with particle and cell, where you represent phase space with a particle sampling. There are some problems for which an Eulerian representation is actually better. So you had to run Chombo in 5D, and that you rapidly realize it was a good idea that I wrote the multi-do, because multi-do just has a Perl processor and it turns it into the right dimension of loop for you. There's many things that are like macros like this. There's a set of macros that if you write a Fortran function in Chombo Fortran, you run the processor on it, it'll build a header file for you that you then can include in your C++ code, so you can make sure you don't actually, the one thing sneaky about Fortran is you can get link errors and not know it, because Fortran doesn't actually check the arguments. So the compiler, if you make a header file out of Fortran, then the C++ compiler will at least realize you sent in the wrong number of arguments. Very common mixed language programming error. The multi-do helps me write dimension-independent Fortran. In the Chombo example, when you download it, you will find in the source directory, so there's Chombo source, it's actually Chombo lib source, sorry. You'll find various directories. There's base tools, box tools, AMR tools, and then you start getting AMR time dependent, AMR elliptic. So AMR elliptic is a directory under the source code system. There's header files for AMR level op, AMR Poisson op, variable coefficient AMR Poisson op, viscous tensor op, and the AMR multigrid. So this is a geometric multigrid written for block structured AMR problems. Geometric multigrid is a very fast kind of order n solver. This is matrix free. For special purpose operators on special purpose data structures, this can run much faster than calling an explicit matrix style solver. And we used to get asked by management, says, we have solver people, you should give them the solver problem. It says, this is a very special solver. It says, honestly, we can write a very fast version if I know exactly what the operator is. So this is very specialized. So in a lot of our, the ways we do hyperbolic and parabolic systems, we use, Chorn et al. Projection style methods. So we do, in a projection type solver, the most common PDE you see that's implicit is Poisson, or the Helmholtz operator. So we use mostly IMEX type schemes, and in IMEX schemes you have an explicit part and an implicit part. And we've sort of biased our systems so that the explicit part is where all the creepy nonlinearity is, and in the implicit part, it's Poisson, right? You can kind of break your system up in various ways, but it's surprising how many PDEs have this property, that you can split it into implicit and explicit. The implicit part just looks like various kinds of Poisson operators. There's a deep math reason for that, but just trust me that it'd be true many a time. So because we can do that kind of decomposition many times, we can write special solvers to do just those types of PDEs. And then you build up things like the MHD equations out of these things. So there's an example for the AMR Poisson code. It's not the example I'm going to be running in the tutorial, but this tends to be where most people end up in the code rather quickly, right? For just doing plain old explicit code, you probably stop at AMR tools and start doing your own thing. All you need is a Flux Register and a data iterator, and off you go. If you want to be doing anything that's kind of mixed explicit, implicit, or the implicit part's the hard thing to do, right? It's hard to get implicit things to scale well. So I put a lot of effort into making AMR multigrid with AMR Poisson up scale well. So don't try to write that yourself. If you really do need an elliptic solve, have somebody else do it for you at big scales. Next thing is, what if I lied? What if your implicit operator really does look crufty? Well, then you can still use Chombo to set up your discretization and get your data structures all set up and do the explicit part for you, and have the implicit part still build an explicit matrix. So you can go through these transforms. This is a little more detailed. I got this slide from Mark Adams. There's a class in Chombo called the PETSc comp grid. And what the PETSc comp grid is going to do is it's going to take an AMR hierarchy and figure out what the flattening is. It's going to figure out for each cell in your AMR hierarchy grid, what's an integer that I could use to talk to a matrix. So this is we had previously been using Hyper's semi-structured interface, but every time one of my application people said, well, I have another stencil and it's reaching out 5 cells, or it's reaching 4 cells in this direction, and I had to keep finding more ways of doing this, I said, buckets. I'm just going to make one global ordering for people, and you take that integer and then you decide in your application how to map that integer into a row and a column in a matrix. So if you have a 5, say there's 6 variables at each grid point, and there are 6 equations. Well, now your variables are your rows, your equations are in your columns, and you have to figure out what your discretization is going to be. But I'm at least going to give you the tools to figure out, once you've calculated a coefficient, where does it go in the matrix? So you use PETSc comp grid, and then you use that to take your int vect and your int. So this is what patch am I? Int vect is a vector of integers, and that is the ijk. So this is what cell am I, and then int would be what equation in that cell am I. And then that'll get, you use this operation to create a little stencil at that point, and then you use another function here where you cram it in. This mgids is what's turning a level data of base fab of PETSc integers back to the user. So you can use your PETSc int here now, and that PETSc int, you can now talk to the PETSc matrix and the PETSc vector. So you saw the mat and the vect yesterday, and then PETSc can then tell me, how do I map that into Hyper? How do I map that into the other algebraic multigrid, or the GMRes, or the the SOR solver? So we don't use this a lot in our kind of production codes. This is very handy for debugging, though. First, you kind of build the matrix and use kind of matrixy tools to figure out, am I even trying to solve a problem that is invertible. I've actually, oftentimes you have a bug in your discretization, and you have all the code and it just crashes, right? It just gets garbage answers, and you don't think you've done anything particularly wrong, but it's hard to find that bug. It's like, you watch some part of the code wiggle, and then it goes blah. If you actually take your operator that would move you forward once in time, build the matrix for it, look at its spectra, you will see things like, well, you have the third eigenterm in that system is negative or much larger than 1. Well, I have a stencil then that reaches out at least 2 or 3 cells that has the wrong coefficient, the wrong sign on it, right? Or are you expecting the system to be symmetric, right? Did you think you're building a symmetric system? You look at the matrix and it's not symmetric. Well, now you have a clue. Now you can go back and start looking at your operators and see what contribution, which of these little sub-stencils was starting to get non-symmetric. So this is a lot of, the code gets kind of large, right? You can see how it's starting to grow a lot when I'm doing these kind of operations. So I'm writing a new version of all of this, but that's not the version you get today. Maybe next year the students will see my very compressed version of all this. Because you can see it grows and grows. But a lot of things you've seen before. So the first few things are, disjoint box layout, level data is FRA boxes, there's phi in his right-hand side, and I build a PETSc op, and I have a boundary conditions, but then at some point here, it transitions, and then it starts looking like PETSc. There's KSP create, KSP get options, KSP solve, right? Those are all PETSc functions. And there's the last operation, which put PETSc in Chombo, and takes the X vector that, did the solve out of the vec and puts it back into phi. And phi was the level data FRA box. So it's taken the problem out of the right-hand side in phi, shoved it into PETSc, done the solve, and put it back into Chombo's data structures. Sometimes multigrid fails, right? Sometimes plain old geometric multigrid, it only really works for things that have, if you have long stretched out skinny grids, the relaxation doesn't work so well. If you have strongly varying coefficients, so you saw VC AMR Poisson up, that's variable coefficients. If the variable coefficients are very strongly varying, it's probably not going to solve it. So you need to bring out the big guns, and the big guns is call a real solver. So now I'll go into my example that's going to be in the tutorial. So this example that you run in your tutorial is doing a polytropic gas. So this is a semi-idealized gas. It is doing what's called the 2D mock reflection wedge test. So in the real experiment that goes with this, you have a wedge in a high-speed wind tunnel. And somewhere upstream, you have a very high pressure reservoir, and then you break the membrane, and you have very high speed flow coming in from the left. It's a Mach 10 shock wave that's coming in to a still air experiment. It hits the wedge and forms a Mach snail. So a Mach snail is a bow shock that's attached to the front of the object, which then reattaches later on the object. You get a Mach tail off the back end, you get a shock boundary layer interaction behind it, and you get a very lovely kind of Mach line structure that goes with it. So this is a actual experiment that people run. We know what the right answer is to very high degree, very high fidelity. And it's been one of those cases where this goes all the way back to Crank and Oliger worked on this as well. But it's one of the original Los Alamos team working on the very first numerical methods. This is very important. We didn't know how to even model high-speed flow, and we were building bombs. So we kind of needed to start figuring this out. So this is a case of we're writing an experiment, doing experiments, we're getting results, we're writing codes, it's getting results, the codes and the experiments aren't matching, and so the two of them, the experimentalists say the numerical people are all messed up, and it turned out to be both sides were making mistakes. And as the numerics got better and better and more solid, they said, I think there's something you're missing in the experiment. And they went back into the experiment again, and sure enough, you have dirt in the system, or the tunnel's not wide enough, so you're getting kind of 3D wall effects. And so they redid the experiment, and they went back and redid the numerics. They went back and forth for about 25 years. They were doing this. So now we really understand. We learned a lot about entropy in this process, because entropy is a very important thing in this type of calculation. Some of you will care a lot about this, and some of you will just want to run the code and say, I have a different problem I want to do with Chombo. So this is part of our release package. So it is one of our released examples. It's under AMR Godunov. So Godunov has several examples where we use second-order Godunov shock capturing techniques. So this is shock capturing, not shock tracking. Shock tracking is a different technology. We also do shock tracking, but you need more machinery to do tracking. So in shock capturing, you try to make sure your shock stays within 2 cells. So you get a sharper and sharper shock as AMR can really zoom in on that shock, and you can control your error very well. You don't actually need to resolve a shock to get a good shock answer. But the pictures are always much prettier than all the blah, blah, blah. So you're going to be running this problem. So it's going to be 100 time steps. It's going to be max time is very short. You're only a fraction of a second for the shock to actually run right through the whole shock tube. Part of what they missed in the experiment originally is they couldn't actually take pictures fast enough. So some of this phenomena, we only had like 2 shots of the whole thing. And photos didn't actually develop quick enough. It's using a Schlerin technique. So that's part of what the disagreement was, is the experiments couldn't actually follow this thing fast enough. This will be you're running in 2D, so you're going to run a max level 2, so this is a 3-level calculation. The ref ratio between each level is a factor of 4, so each level of the AMR hierarchy is 4 times finer in every direction than the level below it. And it's going to be regridding. So the regrid intervals here are 2, 2, and 2. You can put as many 2s as you want. It'll just grab the ones you need. And what that means is in the subcycling diagram I was showing you, every time you go 2 time steps, you run your own tagging algorithm again and generate new grids for the level above you. So as this code's evolving, the fine grids are coming and going very rapidly. The medium ones are kind of coming and going at about a rate your eye can perceive. The level below that is staying as it is. That kind of base grid doesn't be changing, but it is domain decomposed. So when you run this on Vesta, even the coarse grid is running in parallel. So part of the kind of bookkeeping problem all here is, fine grids and middle grids and coarse grids and the ones below it might be all on different processors. Your neighboring box might be on a different processor. The box you're over top of might be on different processors. You might be over top of multiple boxes below you, because we don't enforce that a patch lines up on a patch below it. We have no proper, it's not a tree under the hood, right? In BoxLib, patches can cross, the coarser patches box boundaries. There are packages which do enforce that, and it makes some of the bookkeeping a little easier, but it's a little more restrictive. The blocking factor here is 4, so every patch in this calculation is sized as a multiple of 4. That helps some of the compilers know that it can do certain operations, because you'll always find at least 4 cells, and so you'll have 8 by 16 by 32 by 8 patches in there, but they can be 4 by 32, they can be 8 by 8. Blocking factor is what the modular size is, and the max grid size here is 32. So you're not going to find a patch bigger than 32 in any given direction. You can set your max grid size smaller, and that gives you more patches to work with. So you're finding that you're not getting enough, because it's kind of patch-based parallelism. You set your max, if you set your max grid size too large, oftentimes people say, well, I can't get code to go any faster at 10,000 processors. So the first thing I ask them is, how many boxes do you have? And then they'll tell me, well, in this level I have 4,000, then 400, then 40. I'm like, that's 4,000 patches. You're probably not going to go any faster once you reach the 4,000 processors. There's just nothing to spread around. So keep that in mind. There's a limit to how much you can strong scale the code when it's the flat MPI version. The MPI plus OpenMP version can do a little more, because you can you can make fatter MPI jobs and have threads work inside the box. So the support for doing all that in Chombo, it just takes a little more work. But you can see the beautiful effects on your slides that you have in your hands. The whole problem is inclined. So S is the shock coming in at Mach 10. This is somewhere near the end of your simulation. It'll start on the far left, first hitting that edge, and then as it's coming over, there's post-shocked subsonic flow in behind the Mach snail. This is unshocked still fluid on this side. And in these regions, you have various effects that are labeled. There is a roll-up. There's a Mach line. E and C are Mach lines, if you know what those mean. And you can run it in different modes. So you can change the max level if you like. You have the compute power. Go to 4 levels and see what changes. Increase the blocking factor and see how the code scales. So you can try out different experiments like that. But you can see that changing the ref ratio to 2, you get a much coarser solution. Many of the features are still there. You pretty much get the right Mach speed. You get the right shock location. You get the right shocked versus unshocked. But you're not going to see that roll up. You're not, eventually this problem goes unstable if you run it long enough, and that's because the experiment goes unstable. It actually, this whole structure breaks apart. But that break apart looks different at lower resolution. You actually get the answer wrong. So you need actually like 5 levels to really see that breakup right. But I don't want you to kill the machine. So even in 2D, that takes too long. So that's your problem. You're going to have fun with it, and I'm done.
We have time for probably a few questions.
Yeah.
I was wondering, so in a separate AMR code, they create so every block has the same number of cells, so that helps in the scaling, like that you can distribute.
So there are other AMR packages that do fixed boxes, right? And it's known at compile time what the fixed box is. I've previously thought that's too restrictive. Like you saw how the efficiency changes when I change, how efficiently you have to tile. So in the fixed block size tiling world, you need very deep hierarchies before your efficiencies come back up. So for, say, a 3-level calculation, fixed box sizes really hurts. But as we're going towards the exascale, I'm finding that 5, 6, 7 levels starts becoming kind of normal. So I have a version of Chombo where you actually tell it, fix the box size. And it doesn't actually go that much faster yet, but I'm hoping it will. I know that Flash and Paramesh and Enzo and other packages like that have baked it in because they're tree codes. So in a tree code, you have parent-child relationships that are strongly enforced. And for a long time, they said, this is obviously the better way of doing it, but it didn't actually run any faster than our codes. We might be seeing the turnover now. Like fixed box sizes might work better soon.
Mm-hmm. So your blocks will have different number of cells, right? Because, but do you do anything when you distribute them so that each processor gets same number of tasks?
So there is a load balance. There are several load balancer algorithms that are in play. So the simple heuristic is you count how many cells are in your box. That's a rough approximate for how much work is in that box. And then you order the boxes into a space-filling curve of some kind. So I'm using a Morton ordering for all of my boxes. And then I cut that Morton ordered curve at points where that number adds up to the same amount. So you can also use Hilbert curves. You can also use recursive bisection. Those are all options in Chombo, and some PDEs like different versions of that. You can also, for say, if you're really dominated by, say, point-wise chemistry, like a combustion code, you might go all the way to use knapsack load balancer. You might do something like a really aggressive, perfect load balancer. I find it doesn't make as much difference. The heuristic starts to break down for very complicated nonlinear PDEs. Like where that, cells that have a shock in them do more work. And it's really hard to pick up that fact. So the other mode you run Chombo in is it times how long it took the last time to do the time step, and it uses that to guess how long the next load balancer ought to go. So I call that the feedback load balancer, and that's much more robust. You don't have to guess yourself.
Sorry, one quick question. So about the refinement criteria, so first question is, do you have any default refinement criteria? And the other is, can user introduce its own refinement criteria?
Each of our examples has one put in there. AMR level is the class that you'd override the tag cells function. So it's a virtual function, and by default, it's empty. So we expect you to come up with a criteria. Almost every physics application needs a different criteria. It is so special to the physics.
Thank you.
Do you offer multiphysics support so that you have like two solvers standing next to each other?
So domain-based multiphysics?
For example,
Yeah. The AMR level itself can have, one classic example that we wrote before is conjugate heat transfer. So in some parts of the problem, you're just doing conduction. Some other parts you're doing full up, Boysen-esque, and then some other parts you're doing, real Navier-Stokes. So yes, it's a lot more coding. We have support for it. So we have the ability to say what physics is active in these cells. What's a little harder to do right now is if there's a large variation in how many unknowns there are in the different sections. So BoxLab has been working that area a little more aggressively. So their RAMR, which is their, I'm not sure why it's RAMR, but it's meant specifically for the model changes as resolution changes. So when AMR really tunnels in on a problem, usually the constitutive PDE itself is scale dependent. And so you start changing what the PDE is going to do. That's more of a recent phenomena. We've only recently had machines that will let us really tunnel an AMR calculation across, the statistical mechanic boundaries. The other thing we're doing a lot more of is hybrid. Hybrid involves, some parts of your PDE it's better to do with Lagrangian scheme, some parts Eulerian. So both BoxLab and Chombo support a fairly rich set of kind of particle and cell methods, and how you map data between the particles in AMR hierarchy is quite tricky. So you have the load balance particle, so there's different computational motifs active at the same time. Particle and cell is a very classic PDE modeling technique. If you want to do it in the presence of AMR, it's hard. And there's little tricks with, at a coarse-fine boundary, you have that, Godunov's theorem applies. And that truncation term that comes out actually has structure, and that structure messes up particles. So you actually have to cancel that out.
So when we do a grid convergence test, is there anything special or different from regular grid test?
Yeah, it's horrible. It's very hard to do a grid convergence problem with this. You have to refine all the grid level in the hierarchy and in time. If you're fourth order in space and third order in time, which happens to be a sweet spot, then you have to modify how subcycling works. You don't want to over-refine in time because it's going to fool your system into thinking you're actually third order when you're not, right? Because you're going to break time up a little too finely. So that's one thing. So we tend to switch to, say, fourth in time and fourth in space just because it makes grid convergence easier to verify, and then switch back to third when we do production runs. The other thing is, how do you do scaling studies for this darn stuff? With a weak scaling problem, you're supposed to increase the size of the problem. Well, if I double my base domain and say AMR go, I'm just going to end up refining more. And I don't end up with twice as many fine cells at the end. And that's by design, right? We're supposed to not be refining as much and not doing as much computing. So the common lament, or common, I guess, slag we get is, AMR doesn't scale. I mean, what do you mean AMR doesn't scale? It says, well, I want that nice, clean scaling line. And it's hard to, throw more processors in an AMR calculation and literally, double or triple your speed when you double or triple the cores, because you are doing is kind of very kind of irregular calculation in places, and at some point, these little irregularities are affecting your load imbalance. And it's hard, there are sweet spots, like, Rob was saying yesterday. The sweet spot, we're more sensitive to the sweet spot than most other algorithms. But the usual response is, you go ahead and run whatever other algorithm you want that scales, and then let me know when you catch up, right? AMR calculations can run 100 to 10,000 times faster than the comparable uniform grid. So I don't need 100,000 processors to do a simple problem. You're going to do the Mach-Snell problem on your laptop. Really, you can run this on your iPhone if you wanted to. I'm going to make you run it on Vesta anyways, just because it's a exascale tutorial. But you could run this problem, the problems I can run with this code in other technologies, I need all of BlueGene, Myra to do them. So convergence is one problem, and you have to design carefully to do an adaptive mesh convergence study. Scaling studies are even harder.
Okay, let's thank our speaker. Thanks, Brian.